I start my 75th year next week. And, well, it is true. It's a lot better than the alternative. 7 decades is a long time. And what I want to do is to share something out of each of those decades that has shaped me, has influenced who I am and what I'm about, and the beat goes on. I was born in a small town in western Ohio in 1937. It was at the end of the Great Depression. It was the build-up to World War II, and I was very much aware of what was going on. And what I sensed in our country was a national mobilization that had a common purpose, a common vision, common values, and a common goal. It was clear, it was palpable, and we were all part of it. It was a time when we went to war that everyone in this country was pulling together for the same reason. The reason was not necessarily so noble, it was to defeat the enemy. But I saw many things happen during that time in the 40s, and this is one of the things I saw happening. I saw the beginning of women's liberation. In the 40s, when Rosie the Riveter appeared on the scene, I learned that I learned this as a child, that women could do everything that men could do, and most often better. And we know that Ginger Rogers proved this backwards and in high heels. From 1943 to 1946, this economy stopped making automobiles. And this is what we made. Those assembly lines converted to war machinery. And we won. We prevailed in 2 theaters, both European and American theater. I had an uncle in World War II who was in a tank, hit by a German mortar. He was the only survivor. He never talked about it. We had air raids and blackouts. I could never figure out why we had air raids and blackouts living in Ohio. But it all went dark, and the only light in our house was the light from a radio dial that shone on the floor. But I was never afraid. We had victory gardens. Think of the name, a victory garden. We had rationing. Remember the sticker on the car window that allowed you only so much gasoline? And stamps that we took to the grocery store because we were only allowed so much sugar. And I had a sweet tooth. The 40s, I remember the end of the war, and ringing the bell on the church corner and it getting stuck and they sending me up the ladder to unstick the bell. And we celebrated. We celebrated the end of the war, thinking it was the end of wars, only to learn later that it wasn't. Headlong into the 50s, I spent 6 years in that building, and I really didn't learn very much. I was not academically challenged, but I had a terrific time. I had so many friends. I played 3 sports every year. I played football, basketball, ran track. I got in a lot of trouble. But I learned you could get good grades if you could please the teachers, you could speak in class, you could do well on tests, and you could give the right answers. But I didn't learn much. In fact, I didn't learn so much that I had to go to school between high school and college in order to learn how to study. This was 1955. I took the SQ3R method. It stuck. Survey, question, read, review, recite. And I had to take math, and I had to take English. It was a fun time for me. Also, a lot of schooling and very little education. I also went to school by getting married in 1958, the first time. And I had to learn that it didn't always work. And so when you don't get it the first time, you do it again. And I did, and she's here. Eisenhower. You remember Eisenhower? He said, we have no business getting into a land war in Asia. So what did we do in the 60s? We got involved in a land war in Asia. The 60s, the decade in the 60s, by the way, I learned to type. Forgot that. But it was a manual typewriter. Same keyboard. Probably one of the best courses I took in high school. That and industrial arts is also up here on the hill. Learn how to make things with your hands. This was the 60s for me as an adult. It was a time of tension and conflict and unrest. And we were working on housing, education, and employment. Housing, education, and employment, all segregated. And when Martin Luther King said on August 28, 1963, that if we're going to live in a country where people are judged by their character and not by the color of their skin, we were going to have to do something. My daughter was 1 year old. I knew that if I wanted her to grow up in a country that was different and not segregated, that I was going to have to get involved, and I became a community organizer and activist. 1967, we had the riots in Detroit. And again, I learned the meaning of blackout and a curfew. And just like when I was in high school, I broke the rules. And I stayed out after curfew. And I got jerked out of my car by the National Guard with a rifle in my back. It was not fun. 1968, March. I spent 2 days, Dr. King, in Detroit. A friend of mine on his left, Gene Blake, and many of us worked very hard in the 60s to change what we believed was wrong. And I learned a month later to the day when he was shot and killed that personal sacrifice is a high price to pay for what you believe. And because of my activities in the community and being branded and labeled, I was threatened, my personal safety and that of my family was threatened, such that I had to drop out and leave town. I did not go into the protected witness program, but I went back to graduate school for the second time because I was still learning. I realized actually when I was 44, I'd been in school for 22 years, which was half my life, and I was still not finished. But the 60s were really a decade that got its own name because of all of that, and we escaped, literally, we escaped Detroit, and I went to the idyllic hills of central Pennsylvania and went back to graduate school for the second time. Into the 70s, headlong into the 70s, and I shifted gears and started learning about human development and human motivation and human behavior. I began to teach in schools and universities and hospitals. I taught third-year residents in a family practice specialty. I was on the social science side of the curriculum. They were funny. They were amusing, these residents. They would come back to me where I was videotaping them and say, "How am I doing?" And I would say, "Well, Mr. Smith has mentioned money 3 times and you haven't responded once." He said, "No." I said, "Yes, you want me to play it back for you?" He said, "No, just don't use it in class, okay?" I said, "Do you want to learn? We have to learn from our mistakes and from our failures. We've heard that today. You have to unlearn in order to relearn. And when you invent something new, you have to discard that which you no longer need and weave that into your new learning." So we had fun. The 70s were also a time when people retreated. Maybe it was burnout from the 60s, but they went from street theater to self-analysis. And everyone, it seemed, had an analyst or a guru or a priest or a therapist. And they were in some kind of a group. And if it wasn't 12 steps, it was 24 steps. Some people had to do the group twice. It's true. Every 28-day program doesn't work. But the 70s were such a time that was on the bestseller list for 2 years. Now, I much preferred the sequel, the tongue-in-cheek sequel to this, which is, I'm okay, you're not so hot. The 70s got its own name, coined by Tom Wolfe in 1976, the me decade. The 70s. After the 70s, the 80s. What happened in the 80s? 1980. A young guy by the name of Bill Gates talked to IBM about writing software for their new PC and got IBM to license Microsoft to write the MS-DOS, and you know the rest of that story. The other thing that happened in 1980 was 1984, and this was my computer, and it still is. They still could use this ad that was in 1984 today. I love it. That simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. How many of you thought 10 years ago that you'd be buying a telephone from a computer company? It makes a lot of sense. 1988, the internet. The intranet first, and then the internet. And you know what that has done. I was aware of all this. How many of you know Atari? Dominant in the computer entertainment industry. I never typed anything on a Commodore 64, but I learned how to use computers sufficiently to have a tool in my hand that was supposed to make less work. It hasn't. And the myth of the paperless office? I still have paper in my office. Now, it's nice to get an email that says, do not print this if you don't have to, and you don't. But just think how maybe computers have changed our lives more than television? It's possible. There was a time when we didn't have television in our house for our children, like somebody else, and it was gone, and we read a lot of books, and this was in the late 70s, early 80s. And someone came to our house, and they kept looking around. I couldn't figure out what they were wanting. They said, do you have a TV? I said, we do. It's in the attic. Why do you want it? He said, the World Series is on. Oh, really? So what do we make of all of these things? In the 80s, we also had some excesses that pushed us right on into the 90s. The 90s, I got back involved in reform. I was called back into school reform. And what I discovered was, and I had learned this in the 60s and 70s, that, my golly, I looked at education in the 90s, and we were mired in the 50s. It hadn't changed since I went to school. Now, that is sad. Someone asked earlier today, are you the same person now as you were then, or have you changed? Well, thank God I'm the same person I was, and thank God I've changed. But it became clear to me in the 90s that if we were going to change the way people were doing teaching and learning, it was going to need to be radical. It was probably going to have to come from the outside, because education wasn't going to change, because it was the problem. Still is. And unless we can break out of some of the limitations and remove some of the barriers that we've heard about today, it's not going to get better. It's going to suffer from what it's suffered all along, and that's what I call institutional arteriosclerosis. And until we can loosen it up and get things to start flowing between and among people and institutions and organizations and agencies, and that the communication can flow freely, and not just ideas, but the actual activation and implementation of what we know works. That's what I learned in the 90s. I learned what works. I started 2 new schools from scratch. One of them, actually, I didn't know they didn't have Scratch when we started at a private school, an independent school in New Mexico. But we started it, and let me just tell you one thing that we did. We had no books, we had no furniture, we had no buildings, we had no space. And all of that came into being gradually and then suddenly. That can happen in a good way. And we developed a signature science program, in this school where there are now over 5,000 young people involved in monitoring an ecosystem over 125 miles along the river in 26 different monitoring stations. And they are doing real science. And their collection of data is being fed into these agencies that are making multi-million-dollar decisions. And so I would say to the kids that were here today, yes, you can make a difference, and they are too. Those 5,000 kids up and down the river. The school is on the edge of the cottonwood forest and along the Rio Grande, and it's making a huge difference in the outcome of how people are protecting that ecosystem. And we need to understand eco and economics and microeconomics, oikos and nomos. It's the management of a household. If you translate it literally from the Greek, it's the management of a household. And that's what we need to be about, managing our households and managing our schools and our corporations in such a way that we pay attention to the sacredness of every human being. I thought maybe Susan Scott had talked to Brooks Lee-Born. If you don't know who Brooks Lee-Born is, look her up. She's the one that said to Greenspan, Robert Rubin, and Larry Summers, we need to regulate over-the-counter derivatives. And they said, no, let the markets decide. And what did we learn from that? In this last decade, we learned that it doesn't work. So I leave you with this. It's going to change. What kind of change do you want? Never doubt for a moment that a small group of thoughtful, committed people change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. Thanks.